This is the new 2023 Mazda CX-50, and it's Mazda's latest crossover. It's also very familiar because it's basically a slightly different take on the CX-5, which is Mazda's most popular vehicle. And today, I'm going to review the CX-50 and show you what I mean. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids with no fees. And we've had some great sales recently, including this Mercedes S65 AMG, which sold for $75,000, this fantastic Toyota Land Cruiser that sold for just over $35,000, and this wonderful BMW 3 Series wagon, which brought almost $28,000. We love wagons on Cars and Bids. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it, with daily auctions and great selection at carsandbids.com. So let's talk CX-50. Like I said, it's a different take on the CX-5, which is Mazda's tremendously popular compact crossover, but it's not that different. The CX-5 and the CX-50 share technology, features, engines, even pricing is virtually identical. The big difference is styling. The CX-50 is supposed to be more rugged and tough looking, and there are a few other differences too. And today, I'm going to review the CX-50 and show you. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of this car and show you all of its quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a DOUGSCORE. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features, the CX-50, with a brief overview of what this vehicle is. And like I said, it's supposed to be a more rugged version of the CX-5, which is Mazda's most popular model and a very popular compact crossover overall. Mazda figures if you like the CX-5, but you're an active lifestyle, rugged millennial who wants to go on the trails or mountain biking or hiking on the weekends, then you'll want something more rugged, and this is the vehicle for you. Just how is this more rugged than the CX-5? I'll cover that in a second, but first I want to talk about maybe the strangest thing about the CX-50, and that would be the CX-50 shares its powertrains with the CX-5. It shares its features with the CX-5. Its technology is shared with the CX-5. A lot of its interior is shared with the CX-5. Even 3/4 of its name is shared with the CX-5. But it does not share a platform with the CX-5. Instead, the CX-50 is based on Mazda's smaller CX-30, which is then stretched to become the CX-50. Kind of strange, odd positioning, but Mazda makes some strange decisions here and there. But anyway, that's not really all that important. Most people don't really care what platform is underneath their vehicle. It's not a huge deal. I just bring it up because it is rather odd. More important to the vast majority of potential CX-50 buyers is the engine under the hood. And like I said, the CX-50 shares its powertrains with the CX-5. So that means the entry-level engine is a 187 horsepower, 2.5 liter four-cylinder. That's the base engine in the base model versions of the CX-50, which, by the way, start around $28,000 with shipping, which makes this about $650 more expensive than a comparable CX-5. And that difference stays about the same throughout the trim levels. You'll pay about $650, $700 more for a CX-50 compared to a comparable CX-5. Now, if you want more power, you can also upgrade to this engine, the one in this CX-50, which is a turbocharged version of that same four-cylinder that makes just under 260 horsepower, which is a pretty healthy number for a vehicle this size. Now, obviously, this engine comes on more expensive CX-50 models, and in fact, the sticker price of this one is well over $40,000, which is big money for a little crossover, but you get the powertrain and a lot of other stuff, which I'll show you. Now, one other important item to mention, Mazda says a hybrid version of this vehicle is on the way. So right now, gasoline engines only, but a hybrid is coming. Also worth pointing out that all CX-50 models come standard with all-wheel drive. That's also true of the CX-5. There's no two-wheel drive versions anymore. It's all-wheel drive only for these, which is an interesting advantage compared to most compact crossover rivals, which offer front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive at an extra cost. But anyway, next, let's move on to the biggest difference between the CX-5 and the CX-50, and that would be styling. The CX-50 looks actually quite a bit different than the CX-5, and it's intended to look more rugged. Again, more off-roady, more active lifestyle, outdoors, conquer the trails kind of vehicle. You can see compared to the CX-5, which has a more traditional kind of standard crossover look to it, the CX-50 definitely has a different slant, kind of a different angle, and a different overall look. And frankly, I think the CX-50 looks better overall. I think it's a more attractive car and a lot less generic than the CX-5, which just sort of looks like every other crossover. But the ruggedness, they've achieved this rugged look, or at least they think they have, by doing a few important things to the CX-50. One was squaring off the wheel arches. You can see instead of standard circles, they've gone for sort of a squarish look, which has a tough, rugged feel to it. And they've added more black plastic cladding. You can see directly above the wheels and down the side of the car. Black plastic cladding is supposed to signify rugged toughness and durability, stuff that can get scratched up on the trails while you're going over rocks and boulders. And so this car has that to emphasize its ruggedness. But beyond just the style, one big difference with the CX-50 compared to the CX-5 is that the dimensions are surprisingly different. For one thing, ground clearance. The CX-50 has about an inch more ground clearance than the CX-5. So it actually does have more capabilities, at least in terms of what you can roll over. But in addition to raising up the ground clearance, they've also lowered the height of this vehicle overall. So they've raised it up from the bottom and lowered it from the top, and the result is sort of a more squat look, which does kind of give it a more aggressive off-roady stance. But there's still more in terms of dimensions. Probably the most noticeable change is the width. The CX-50 is 3 inches wider than the CX-5, which in compact crossover terms is a massive number. All of these vehicles tend to be within an inch or two of each other. This one being 3 inches wider is a huge deal. And most of that width seems to have gone to these rather wide flared fenders, front and rear. You can see it really does give this car kind of a brawny, bulky, muscular look, even though it's just a compact crossover. But it's a compact crossover with flared fenders. And to complement the flared fenders, they've even added these fake rear vents in back. Now, I'm not a fan of fake vents. I always think they look stupid, and that's kind of the case here too. But you gotta hand it to Mazda for adding flared fender vents to a compact crossover. It does give it a certain look. You also have fender vents up front. You can see these are not entirely fake. There's a small opening part in the bottom that may actually do something. I'm not entirely sure, but you do have these vents front and rear to emphasize the width of this car and give it a more aggressive feel. Now, one other big dimensional change compared to the CX-5, this is longer. The CX-50 is about 6.5 inches longer than the CX-5, which is also a pretty big difference. So this car is longer in length, wider overall, but shorter in height, which gives it certainly a different look, especially with those flared fenders. But since we're talking through changes between the CX-5 and the CX-50 and differences and advantage of the CX-50, let's discuss cargo room, which isn't one of them. Even though the CX-50 is quite a bit longer than the CX-5, it doesn't actually have more cargo space. Now, it's worth pointing out the CX-50's cargo area looks bigger than what you have in the CX-5 because it is longer. So you have more of a cargo floor back here, which can be useful. But because the roof height is lower and because the ground clearance has been raised, I guess that kind of shuts in the cargo area a little bit. And so the overall cubic feet capacity of the cargo area is barely higher in the CX-50 than in CX-5. Not really noticeably so. Now, it's also worth pointing out one other big benefit in the cargo area back here, and that would be how easy it is to drop the rear seats. You have this little handle over on the side, you just pull it and the seats fall right down. Same deal over on the other side, just pull it and the seats fall down. And then you have a massive cargo area back here where you can stick pretty much anything you might want. Also worth pointing out, one other benefit since I'm back here is towing. The CX-50, intended to be used by these active lifestylers taking weekend trips, it can tow quite a bit more than the CX-5. Mazda says this is rated for 3,500 pounds of towing capability versus only 2,000 pounds max in the CX-5. So if you want to tow stuff and you want a Mazda crossover, the CX-50 is the one to get. But anyway, next we move inside the CX-50, and the first thing you notice when you open the door and get in this car is It's nice. It is really nice in here. Take a look at the seats. You have this gorgeous brown trim, these beautiful cords on the side of the seat, and contrast stitching down the center, which looks absolutely fantastic, like what you'd find in a real luxury car. Same deal on the dashboard. You have this contrast stitching the entire way across that looks fantastic, and this is also carried on to the door panels. You can see it here. Beautiful leather and contrast stitching. And beyond that, you have just a nice, attractive, well laid out, kind of minimalist interior that really looks good in this car. It's a beautiful interior, but like I said, you're paying for it because this particular CX-50 is in the low to mid $40,000 range. So it's pretty pricey for a compact crossover. The good news is it has an interior that really feels like it lives up to the price point. But it's worth pointing out that this interior does have one rather large drawback, and that would be the infotainment system. The screen is located up here, very high up below the windshield in the middle of the dashboard, and you can't really reach it. But that doesn't matter because it's not a touchscreen. Mazda has waged a war on touchscreens, and they insist that touchscreens are bad, you shouldn't have them, and they insist that they are right in this philosophy, even though every other automaker uses a touchscreen. So, for this vehicle to control the infotainment system, you have this knob here in the center console, and you have to twist it and move through various different menus and screens. Now, they make it relatively easy. You have 4 buttons surrounding the knob that you can press to bring up various parts of this screen. Like the music note brings up your music, the home button brings up the home screen, the arrow brings up the map. You get the idea. Then, of course, you have a volume control down here, next track. It's all relatively simple if you have to use a knob and buttons instead of a touchscreen. Frankly, I find this disappointing, and I've had an argument with Mazda about this exact thing. Touchscreens are just more familiar to the customer from their cell phones and other devices and from other vehicles, pretty much all of which use touchscreens. Now, Mazda says touchscreens take your eye off the road, and by doing it this way, the screen is pretty much in your line of sight. You control it with your hand down in the center console, and you don't have to look at a screen. But the problem with that is that a touchscreen, you can tap something and it happens. In this, you gotta scroll over to a menu, go down with the knob, find what you're looking for. And so even though a touchscreen may take your eyes off the road, this requires your concentration for longer. And it's just disappointing and kind of clunky. One amazingly interesting thing about this system, though, it's integrated with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto like most vehicles, and those systems were, of course, designed for touchscreens. And so if you have those connected, this becomes a touchscreen, and then you can use it as a touchscreen to control Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. But the problem is the placement. It's so far away, you can't feasibly reach it to control those things, so you're gonna still be using the controller knob. To me, this isn't a deal breaker of this car because you do get used to the knob and the controls, but a touchscreen would just be so much easier. And Mazda has implemented touchscreens in some of their other cars owing to feedback about this system, but in this one, you still have the controller knob. But anyway, on the subject of this touchscreen, it does have some rather interesting configurable items in here. For example, you can change the volume of the turn signal sound inside the car. The little clicking sound the turn signal makes when it's on, you can adjust that volume in here. Also, another unusual item is the fuel door lock delay. So when you lock the car, you can delay how long it is before the fuel door locks. I guess so you go to a gas station, you lock the car, the fuel door won't lock immediately, so you still have time to open it and pump with fuel. But that is a configurable setting in here. Never really seen that before, and rather strange. But onto the other screen in this interior, which is in the gauge cluster, and frankly, it's rather small. The only screen part is pretty much in the center gauge, and you can't really do all that much with it. You can change between a few different screens, as you can see, but it's nothing especially important. Your driver assist technology, a couple of trip odometers, and that's about it. No full screen map here. You can't see music here, which is a little bit disappointing, especially since they went to the trouble of putting in a high resolution full color screen. You'd think you'd be able to do more with it, but it doesn't have that option. Not a huge deal though, since many rivals in this compact crossover class also don't have those features in their gauge screen. One interesting thing though about the gauge screen that's worth mentioning is it'll show you stop signs when you're approaching them. You can see right here, the car will read traffic signs and not just give you the speed limit, but let you know if you're coming up to a stop sign. The heads-up display will do the same thing. You can see I'm approaching this stop sign and it's telling me that I'm approaching a stop sign, which I guess is somewhat useful information. Interesting to see integrated into screens in this car. By the way, one other item worth pointing out with the gauge gauge cluster, you can get it to change a little bit more than I showed you before with the drive modes. There is a drive mode switch in this car, which is labeled Me Drive for some reason, and you can use it to cycle through a few different drive modes. Right now it's in normal mode, you can see the gauge cluster here, but if you go into sport mode, then it will turn red, and it stays red and kind of sporty. Or you can go into a new off-road mode, as you can see, and then it turns beige, the color of off-roading, I suppose. And I'm not exactly sure what this drive mode does, but it certainly gives you more confidence in your rugged millennial lifestyle off-roader CX-50. But anyway, other interior quirks in this vehicle, not that many. Like I said, relatively minimalist interior, fairly simple, but a few things worth noting. For one, the center storage compartment is actually 2 different armrests, and they can open separately. So the driver can rest their arm on the armrest, but the passenger can get into the center console to find something, which is nice. No compromises here. You also have a nice positioning for the wireless charging pad. You can see it's kind of integrated under the front of this center armrest area, so your charging pad and your phone don't have to be just sitting out while you're driving along, which is pretty cool. One interesting and rather odd placement in this vehicle is the passenger climate control vents. You can see over on the driver's side, these 2 kind of silver trimmed vents, pretty much exactly where you'd expect them. And then on the passenger side, over on the edge of the dashboard, another silver trimmed vent looks about the same. But there's one more vent, and it's here, kind of randomly stuck in the middle of the dashboard. Sort of odd, weirdly placed extra climate vent that doesn't match the other 3 in placement or size or appearance or anything. Certainly an odd position for that one. And next up we move on to the back seat of the CX-50, which I have to say is a lot roomier than I was expecting. For one thing, legroom is pretty good. Leg and knee room. For me, a rather tall adult, I fit back here just fine. But the real surprise for me is headroom. Like I mentioned, they lowered the overall height of this vehicle, but raised the ground clearance. So I figured that would squeeze the passenger compartment and kind of make it tight in here, but it really isn't. I can sit up straight and my head is just barely starting to touch the ceiling, which is just fine. I've actually read some reviews of this car that complained about rear seat headroom, but I wonder how tall the person sitting back there was. I'm 6'4", and it doesn't really bother me at all. It's surprisingly roomy in back. Nothing really quirky or interesting back here, although a few items worth noting. For one, you have climate vents in the back, which is nice. Not all compact crossovers do, so that's nice to see. You also have heated rear seats, which is a nice luxury touch back here, and 2 USB ports, as you can see, which is nice for rear passengers charging their devices. But other than that, fairly standard rear seat area in this car, nothing too exciting or interesting, except you do have some of that same beautiful stitching up front in back. You can see down the center, this gorgeous contrast stitching still looks good. You don't have as much of it in back, no door panel stitching back here. You don't have those beautiful bronze rope cord things on the sides of the seats, but it is still pretty nice in back, which complements what you have in front, and that's nice to see. And finally, back on the outside of the CX-50 for 2 interesting quirks worth noting. One is the turn signals, which you can see turn on and then fade out slowly. Turn on and then fade out slowly. This is a hallmark of most or maybe all new Mazda models, these sort of fading turn signals, which look very cool and they're very distinctive to Mazda. And it's a cool way to get into like the fun lighting game that a lot of automakers are doing without overdoing it or doing something silly or weird with your lights. It certainly does look cool. The other item worth noting outside is the wheels. This particular CX-50 has 20-inch wheels, which means that even a compact Mazda crossover is rolling on dubs these days. It's pretty crazy to imagine compared to just a few years ago. Obviously, these are not the standard wheels, they're optional upgrades, but still 20s on a compact Mazda crossover. And so, those are the quirks and features of the new 2023 Mazda CX-50. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the CX-50 Turbo. First thing I'm gonna do here is step on it. And what you discover is that this car is only reasonably quick. It's kind of interesting. Never has 256 horsepower felt more like 216 horsepower in this car. I'm not exactly sure why it is. It's a small engine, it feels a little stressed, but other automakers have small turbo engines that feel really powerful and quick, and this one just doesn't quite. It could be the transmission. This is kind of an older transmission unit with fewer gears than rivals, but I think about like the Ford Ranger and its great turbo 4-cylinder, and not that it's a competitor to this, but that powertrain is similar size and it's just so much quicker. And I don't want to say this car feels slow, because I don't believe that, and it doesn't. It doesn't feel slow, but given 256 horsepower in a compact crossover, that would be a big number for most rivals. That's among the top of the class, and the car doesn't really feel all that fast. It only feels adequate, totally fine, but I mention this because I bet the base powertrain really does not feel particularly adequate. And I've found it interesting that Mazda has taken great care to give CX-50s to journalists. All of them are the turbo model. There are no reviews out of the base engine, and I suspect that's because it's just dog slow. So let's talk over the other pros and cons of this car. Powertrain, like I said, adequate, pretty good, but there's a lot of other stuff here worth noting. One is the driving experience. You know, most journalists talk about how Mazdas drive better, even their little crossovers drive better, and I find that to be true here too. This car has nice, heavy, tight steering, which I really like. I'm not sure if everyone will really like it, but I love the feedback and the feel of tight steering, and this car has that, and it gives you the impression that you know what you're doing at all times. There's no vagueness. There's almost a sportiness to that. And then in addition, the car just feels good around corners, which is so weird to say in a compact crossover. And I'm not calling it a sports car or saying it's anything even on that level, but you got a big wide stance, you got a lower center of gravity, you have this nice steering. Mazda does a good job with suspension and chassis tuning, and this car just feels kind of fun when you're throwing it around, which of course nobody is ever going to do in this thing, given that it's a Mazda crossover for families, but it's there if you want it, which is nice to see. In terms of driving position here, it feels a lot like every other compact crossover. It's not that high. It doesn't feel like you're king of the road in a, you know, big SUV or anything, but it's good enough to have a bit of a, you know, seating position advantage over sedans and most cars. Nice and comfortable in here. The seats are very nice, and like I said, the interior is very luxurious. The materials are nice. They look good. Everything looks nice in here, and it's a high quality driving experience. Noise is not a big problem in here. You do have road noise more than you would get in most like nicer vehicles, expensive luxury cars, but for a compact crossover, it's about normal and it's about natural. Frankly, it's about normal is something you can generally say about the driving experience for this car. Like I said, the engine is not too powerful. There's not an excessive amount of room in here. There's not crazy benefits or drawbacks to visibility or driving experience. It just feels like a compact crossover. The distinct advantages this car has are the interior is nicer than most, and the steering and handling is nicer than most. And apparently it has a little bit of off-road capability, which is what everybody's after right now. But generally speaking, I would say this is basically a CX-5, except it looks better. In my opinion, there's no question about that. There's a little bit more passenger room, even though there's not more cargo room. And also you got a little bit more capability, a little bit more ground clearance, a little bit more towing capacity, and frankly, a slightly nicer interior. So there are some like kind of little advantages over the CX-5, plus the more stylish exterior. And I could understand easily why someone would prefer this over CX-5. It makes a lot of sense to me. And so that's the Mazda CX-50. There's a lot of CX-5 in this vehicle, but there are some nice benefits too. Frankly, I think it looks a little better, and it's a little bit larger inside and a little nicer with a few other subtle benefits here and there. Frankly, I would buy this over a CX-5, although both are very compelling little crossovers. Anyway, now it's time to give the CX-50 a DOUGSCORE. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 48 out of 100, which places the CX-50 here against rivals. The CX-50 scores well, beating out most regular compact crossovers like the standard Mazda CX-30 and the Toyota RAV4. But the CX-50 can't top small crossovers with some sort of interesting hook, like the Kia Soul with its funky styling, or the RAV4 Prime with its plug-in hybrid drivetrain, or the Mini Countryman and Mazda CX-30 Turbo with their excellent performance. The DOUGSCORE is meant to be biased towards vehicles like those that are a little more interesting and exciting than the CX-50, but if basic, normal, practical is what you want, the CX-50 delivers, with some nice styling included.